This is the kind of moment that changes the temperature of politics in a single afternoon. One statement, one response, one miscalculation. So severe that the shockwave is already moving through capitals, boardrooms, trading desks, and campaign war rooms at the same time. Because what just happened between Mark Carney and Donald Trump was not a routine exchange, not another noisy headline designed to burn hot for 6 hours and disappear by morning. This felt bigger, sharper, more dangerous, and for Trump, far more costly than the people around him expected. Carney answered in a way that did not just push back. He reset the battlefield. He turned a pressure move into a vulnerability, a threat into leverage, and a show of force into a spectacle of overreach. And now Washington is dealing with the consequences in real time. Because here's what makes this so significant. This is not just about two powerful men trading blows across a political border. This is about whether intimidation still works when the target refuses to flinch. It is about whether economic threats can still dominate a neighboring ally when the response is disciplined, credible, and designed not for the news cycle, but for the power structure underneath it. This is about markets, supply chains, institutions, investor confidence, diplomatic alignment, and the brutal reality that in a high-stakes confrontation, the side that keeps its nerve often wins before the other side even understands it is losing. What unfolded here is not a policy dispute, it is a power struggle. And Trump just discovered that the old playbook does not always survive first contact with a prepared opponent. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened in the exchange that left Trump's team scrambling. I'm going to show you why Carney's response landed with such force and why it traveled far beyond the immediate headline. I'm going to explain the mechanics of why this backfired worse than expected, especially inside the business and strategic circles Trump depends on. I'm going to reveal what was happening behind the scenes where the real panic doesn't show up on camera, but absolutely shapes what happens next. I'm going to break down how key players are reacting, from political allies to financial actors to the media ecosystem that suddenly realized this was not a one-day story. And I'm going to show you where this goes next, because the next move now matters even more than the first one. And if you value sharp political analysis that cuts through the theater and gets to the actual power dynamics, subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is the part casual viewers miss. The headline is dramatic. The deeper reality is even more dramatic. So let's start with the immediate event, because the immediate event is everything. Trump made the kind of move Trump loves to make. Loud, public, dominant in tone, designed to project control before the dust even settles. The message was unmistakable: pressure, urgency, strength. The assumption behind it was just as clear: push hard enough, speak forcefully enough, create enough noise, and the other side either backs down, softens, or starts negotiating from fear. That is the model. That is the instinct. That is the performance. But what happened next is where the whole thing turned. Carney didn't answer with panic. He didn't answer with outrage for its own sake. He didn't answer by matching Trump decibel for decibel, because that would have been fighting on Trump's terrain, and that terrain is designed to reward chaos. Instead, Carney answered with the one thing that can puncture a pressure campaign faster than any insult ever could: cold strategic clarity. The tone mattered. The language mattered. The sequencing mattered. It was measured without being weak. Direct without being theatrical, and firm without sounding impulsive. And that combination is precisely what made it so devastating. Because when one side is trying to dominate the emotional atmosphere and the other side responds like it has already game theorized the entire confrontation 3 steps ahead, the aggressor suddenly looks less powerful, not more. Picture the scene. Cameras up, statements moving instantly across every network and platform, analysts trying to catch up in real time, political aides refreshing feeds, market participants reading beyond the words into the implications, and then Carney's response lands and the energy shifts. You can feel it. The conversation stops being "how far will Trump go?" and becomes, "did Trump just trigger something he cannot easily control?" That is the pivot. That is the humiliation. Because for a move like this to work, it has to create fear. It has to create hesitation. Instead, it created consolidation on the other side and doubt on his own. Here's what this means. Carney understood that the real audience was never just Trump. The real audience was everyone watching how Trump's pressure would be handled. Investors deciding whether instability was becoming a structural risk. Allies deciding whether alignment with Washington came with increasing volatility. Corporations deciding whether political escalation would hit their costs, and voters deciding who looked serious when the stakes stopped being symbolic and started becoming material. Carney's response was crafted for that larger audience. That is why it hit so hard. He was not merely rebutting Trump, he was isolating Trump. And that tells you everything you need to know about why this backfired worse than expected. Trump's move appears to have been designed as a test of dominance. The assumption was that a hardline would force retreat or concession, but a dominance test only works if the other side accepts the frame. Carney rejected the frame completely. He reframed the confrontation not as Trump imposing terms, but as Canada defending institutional stability, economic sovereignty, and strategic credibility against reckless coercion. That is a completely different story. It turns the aggressor into the risk factor. It turns the target into the adult in the room. And once that narrative hardens, the balance of pressure changes immediately. The mechanics of this are brutally important. So let me walk you through them. Trump's political power thrives on asymmetry. He hits first loudly and forces everyone else to react to him. That gives him tempo. Tempo creates intimidation. Intimidation creates concessions. But Carney's response disrupted the tempo. Instead of chasing Trump's escalation, he slowed the frame down and made the costs visible. Not abstract costs, real costs, economic spillover, market uncertainty, cross-border damage, strategic mistrust, institutional backlash. Suddenly, the issue was no longer whether Trump sounded strong. The issue was whether he had just destabilized a relationship too important to weaponize carelessly. That shift is catastrophic for the original strategy, because strength theater is much less effective when audiences start calculating price tags. And make no mistake, this is where the deeper strategic layer appears. Carney's background matters in a confrontation like this because he speaks the language of credibility, risk, and systemic consequence. He understands something many political operators either miss or underestimate. In moments of confrontation, markets don't just listen to who is angrier. They listen to who sounds governable. Institutions don't just react to threat volume, they react to who appears capable of managing second-order effects. Allies don't just watch for toughness, they watched for reliability. Carney's response was devastating because it was calibrated to those audiences. Trump aimed at headlines. Carney aimed at trust. In a crisis atmosphere, trust is a strategic weapon. Now, if you're getting value from this, stay with me because the next part is the real revelation. The public exchange was only the visible layer. The more important story is what this did behind the scenes. Because behind the scenes is where the backfire becomes undeniable. The moment Carney answered with control instead of panic. Every stakeholder who had hoped this would remain a manageable confrontation had to reassess. Advisors start gaming out retaliation. Business leaders start asking whether this will disrupt investment decisions. Supply chain planners start imagining friction. Diplomats start making calls. Surrogates start testing arguments. Legal teams begin reviewing authorities. Internal discussions turn from can we pressure them to can we contain this? And that is the moment the operation changes character. A pressure campaign becomes a damage control campaign. A planned escalation becomes an exposed gamble. You can almost see the split-screen version of the story. In Ottawa, disciplined language, strategic messaging, deliberate posture. In Trump world, a burst of heat, then a scramble to shape the fallout, then a search for a new line of attack that doesn't look like retreat. That is a hard position to occupy because once a threat fails to produce submission, it loses some of its mystique. And once it starts producing costs for your own side, it becomes politically radioactive. The problem for them is simple. Every effort to intensify now risks proving Carney's point about recklessness, and every effort to soften risks confirming that the original move failed. That is not leverage, that is entrapment. And this is why the response feels so bruising for Trump personally. And strategically, Trump's political identity depends heavily on perceived dominance. He can survive outrage, he can survive controversy, he can survive endless media storms. What is much harder to survive, especially in a high-profile confrontation, is visible resistance that looks effective, not emotional resistance. Effective resistance, resistance that absorbs the blow, returns it with structure, and leaves your own side asking whether this was worth it. That is the dangerous kind. That is the kind that spreads. What happened next only intensified that. Perception. Media reaction shifted quickly from spectacle to consequence. The language changes when a story stops being entertainment and becomes a risk event. Coverage starts focusing on fallout. Commentators start asking whether Trump misread the room. Financial voices begin weighing in. Political allies become more careful with their wording. Some go silent. And silence in moments like this is never neutral. Silence is often a warning sign. Silence means people are waiting to see whether this gets worse before they fully attach themselves to it. Silence means the confidence is not complete. Let me give you 3 implications because this is where the wider meaning of the story comes into focus. First, this exposed a weakness in Trump's coercive model. Not that he cannot still create fear. He can. Not that he cannot still dominate headlines. He can. But this showed that if the opposing side answers quickly, coherently, and with institutional credibility, the intimidation cycle can be broken. That matters far beyond this one confrontation. It tells every government, every negotiator, every political rival, and every major stakeholder that the key is not to outshot him. The key is to deny him psychological control of the scene. Carney did that cleanly second. This elevated Carney's stature instantly because moments like this are leadership tests, and leadership tests are rarely passed by sounding the most emotional. They are passed by sounding the most composed under maximum pressure. Carney came across not as a man dragged into Trump's drama, but as a strategist using Trump's drama against him. That is a major shift in perception. It says competence. It says command. It says this is someone who can stand in a storm and make the storm look disorganized. Whether you support him or not, that impression matters and it travels third. This is consequences beyond the personalities involved because it redefines the cost of escalation in a critical relationship. Once the public and the market start viewing this kind of confrontation as a source of tangible instability, the room for improvisation shrinks. Every future threat becomes more expensive. Every future response becomes more scrutinized. Every future headline now carries the memory of this moment. The moment a show of force turned into an own goal. And that third implication may be the most important of all because what we are watching is not just one backfire. We are watching the price of impulsive power politics rise in full view of people who usually tolerate it as long as it looks effective. Once it stops looking effective, the coalition around it gets thinner. Not overnight, not all at once, but visibly. Let me take this one level deeper because casual viewers often stop at the rhetorical clash and miss the structural reality underneath. This wasn't just Trump versus Carney, this was improvisation versus preparation, personal force versus institutional leverage, spectacle versus credibility. And in this round, credibility won. Not softly, not politely, decisively. Because the more Trump tried to define the confrontation as a test of who could project greater strength, the more Carney turned it into a test of who could impose greater costs on the other side's narrative. That is advanced political jujitsu. And it is humiliating when it works. Think about the visual symbolism. Trump's style depends on occupying the center of the frame, dominating attention, setting the emotional weather. But Carney's response effectively changed the camera angle. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on Trump's force. It was on Trump's miscalculation, not on his threat, but on its failure. Not on his control, but on the unintended consequences he had just unleashed. That is a nightmare for any political operation built around strength perception, because once the question becomes, why did this blow up in your face? You're already on defense, and the reaction from key players tells the story. Business interests hate unnecessary volatility. Diplomats hate preventable deterioration. Institutions hate unpredictable shocks. Political allies hate avoidable weakness. When those groups begin converging on the same conclusion that a movement to demonstrate power has instead complicated the landscape, you have a serious problem. Maybe not a fatal problem, but a serious one, because those are the groups that shape sustainability, They are the groups that decide whether an aggressive strategy is worth defending for a second round. What's more, Carney didn't need to overplay his hand. That is part of what made this so effective. He did not need maximal outrage. He did not need melodrama. He did not need to declare some grand crusade. He only needed to do three things: stand firm, sound credible, and define the consequences better than Trump defined the threat. Once he did that, the burden shifted. Trump now has to prove that escalation produces results rather than recoil. That is a much harder case to make. After a visible backfire, the pattern is clear. When pressure meets weakness, it expands. When pressure meets structure, it can collapse inward. That is what happened here. And if you haven't already, subscribe now, because the final part of this breakdown is the part that matters most. What happens next and why the next move may be even more dangerous than the first. Because Trump is now facing the kind of strategic dilemma powerful figures hate the most. If he escalates, he risks confirming every warning Carney just elevated. That this is not a calculated strategy, but a destabilizing impulse with wider consequences. Escalation might satisfy the instinct to reassert dominance, but it could also deepen market anxiety, widen diplomatic resistance, and hand Carney an even bigger platform from which to appear serious and steady. On the other hand, if Trump softens or pivots too quickly, the perception becomes unavoidable. He pushed hard, got checked, and stepped back for a political brand built on never appearing cornered. That is brutal. So what are the most likely scenarios from here? The first scenario is controlled escalation. More rhetoric, more posturing, more attempts to reframe the dispute on terms friendlier to Trump's base and media ecosystem, while quietly trying to avoid the kind of material escalation that would intensify blowback. In other words, look fierce, act selectively. That is probably the easiest short-term option, but it carries a huge weakness. It still leaves Carney with the credibility advantage if he continues sounding like the more responsible actor. The second scenario is indirect retreat. No dramatic walk back, no explicit concession, just a gradual shift in emphasis, a reframing of priorities, and an effort to move the spotlight elsewhere. This is politically cleaner but psychologically harder because it means accepting that the original move failed to achieve its objective. Operations like Trump's do not enjoy absorbing that kind of symbolic loss, especially in public. The third scenario is the most dangerous one. Overcorrection, a bigger move, a harsher posture, a more confrontational line designed to erase the perception of being checked. This is the highest risk path because it can transform a damaging backfire into a full-blown strategic crisis. And that is precisely why this moment matters so much. Once a leader feels the need to restore dominance after a failed coercive attempt, the temptation to overreact grows. History is full of situations where the second move caused more damage than the first. Now let's be very clear about the winner-loser dynamic here because the script of this confrontation is no longer ambiguous. Carney emerged stronger because he demonstrated leverage without hysteria. Trump emerged weaker because the move that was supposed to reinforce his image instead exposed a limit. That does not mean Trump is finished. It does not mean he cannot recover. It means that in this round, the asymmetry reversed the side expected to absorb pressure, converted that pressure into an indictment of the side applying it. That is rare. That is politically powerful, and that is why the reaction has been so intense. There is also something larger and more historic embedded in this showdown. We are entering a phase of politics where performative strength is colliding with a harder reality. Systems, markets, alliances, and institutions can no longer be treated as stage props without consequence. When leaders gamble with those systems for leverage, they are no longer just managing narratives, they are testing tolerances. And when the test fails, the penalty is not only reputational, it becomes strategic, it becomes economic, it becomes institutional. Carney understood that Trump, at least in this moment, underestimated it. So when you hear that Carney's response left Trump reeling, understand what that really means. It does not merely mean Trump was angered, it means the response disrupted his leverage, altered the optics, shifted the coalition dynamics, raised the perceived cost of further escalation, and forced a reassessment across the board. That is what reeling looks like in elite politics. Not always a dramatic outburst in public, Sometimes it looks like a room full of advisors trying to redesign tomorrow's message because today's strategy just detonated in their hands. And when you hear that this backfired worse than expected, that is not media exaggeration. That is the core truth of the story. It backfired because the objective was dominance and the result was exposure. It backfired because the target was supposed to bend and instead stood taller. It backfired because the threat was supposed to simplify the landscape and instead made it more hostile, more complex, and more expensive for the side that launched it. It backfired because Carney did not simply answer the move. He revealed the weakness inside the move. That is the final verdict. Trump reached for intimidation and found resistance. He reached for control and found consequence. He reached for a quick strategic win and triggered a much larger test of credibility that he did not fully own by the end of the exchange. Carney, by contrast, saw the moment for what it was, absorbed the pressure, and returned something far more damaging than outrage. He returned discipline. He returned structure. He returned a message that landed not just in headlines, but in the minds of everyone who matters when power is being measured under pressure. And that is why this moment feels so big. Because sometimes a political confrontation tells you more than either side intended to reveal. Sometimes the real story is not the threat. It is the failed threat, not the noise, but the silence that follows it. Not the punch, but the realization that the punch did not work. And in politics, that realization can be more dangerous than the punch itself. This was not just a bad day for Trump. This was a strategic warning shot wrapped inside a public humiliation. Carney did not merely survive the attack. He made the attack look reckless, costly, and weak. And once that happens, the entire board changes. Trump wanted a submission. What he got was a counterstrike. And now the world is watching what he does when the strongman script stops.